Shel, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to chat with you.
My pleasure, Jesse.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and what you write about.
Sure. I have been a writer going all the way back really to high school. And I've written 10 books, and four of them are on marketing for green and ethical and social change companies and organizations. My most recent is called Guerrilla Marketing to Heal the World. It's my second book in the long-running guerrilla marketing series with my co-author, J. Conrad Levinson, who has since passed on. And that's all about how to market differently to different audiences. That if you're a green company, you don't only have to market to greens, for example, and also that you can market products that make a difference on things like hunger, poverty, racism, climate change, and make a profit at the same time.
That sounds like something we all need, especially me as a business owner myself. So thank you for bringing that information to the world. You've written 10 books. You've obviously done the process of blank page to final draft a lot of times. But
Mhm.
what has been, maybe a reoccurring struggle, or thinking about your first book, what were some of the struggles you encountered when you were doing that writing process?
Well, my first book was a really weird project because I was working as a manuscript reader for a literary agent in New York City, and I'm still kind of in that world. I do book shepherding now, mostly of green and socially conscious books, and so I was reading for him, and he had written a book that I had used in a research paper in college called "Perils of the Peaceful Atom," which was all about what a bad thing nuclear power was. And during that time, 3 Mile Island happened, and he got a contract to revise this at that time 10-year-old book, and he threw that to me. So at 22 years old and working for this guy part-time for like $10 a manuscript, telling him whether he should take it on or not, I was suddenly a book author. And so that book was in the typewriter era, and the manuscript I turned in was actually sections of his old book cut up and pasted with new typescript that I added on a manual typewriter. And so we've come a long way since then. But my first book that I did completely on my own was my first book on marketing. 8 of my 10 are on marketing. And that was a small self-published book called Keep Your Money, How to Save Thousands in Advertising. And I knew that I was about to buy a computer. So I waited to start the book until I bought the computer. It was one of the original Macs, 128K of memory, and it could hold an 8-page file. And so that book, some of the chapters were 3 files long.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we've come a long, long, long way from that point. And that book, I can't remember if I used an outline or not for that book. I know by the time I did my third book and second marketing book that I did use an outline. I also know that for me, an outline is a rough guide, and the writing and the research will take me into different directions. And that I actually, almost the only time I have failed in writing in any kind of writing project, there were two. One was when I was hired to write a textbook, and I submitted an outline, and they said, great. And then as I'm writing the book wants to go in different directions. And they said, no, 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 you have to follow the outline. Like, really? You don't want this and you don't want that? And we ended up parting ways. And then the other failure was a ghostwriting assignment where there were issues that were really more interpersonal. And other than that, I'm proud to say that when I've been hired to do something, I've gotten it done.
Awesome. That's awesome. Were there any sort of mindset shifts that you needed to make in order to maybe overcome perfectionism or imposter syndrome or anything like that as you were writing? Did you ever run into any of that?
Yeah, I would say imposter syndrome was definitely a factor, especially early on. And I had to realize that after I did Marketing Without Megabucks for Simon and Schuster, which there was a lot of research that went into that book. It was a huge expansion and revision of my original self-published marketing book, and it was roughly, I don't know, 8 times as long. So it was basically a whole new book with a few small pieces from the old one.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that having run my own business at that time for about a decade, that I did know some things about marketing, and that I knew how to find out the other stuff that I didn't know yet. And so, yeah, I did have to get out of the idea that I was an imposter, that I really was no expert at all. And that book, it came out in 1993, and other than that, it doesn't address the internet at all. I have like 7 pages about it, which was a lot for 1993. But the information that is in the book is still basically pretty current. There's lots and lots of new information since then, of course, and that's part of why I've done a lot of marketing books since then. But when I go back and I look at what I did in 1991 that was published in 1993, I think, gee, this is really pretty good. The stuff about how to write a decent press release, for example, is timeless and something that I wish more companies would follow, because so many people do chest beating, we're so great press releases, and I like tell the story. I specialize in story behind the story press releases, as I call them. And so instead of writing a press release like everybody else would, when I was hired by a client who had a book on electronic privacy, it was not electronic privacy expert releases new book. My headline was, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your credit history is? And then I talked about how it might be vacationing in data banks of big companies, and the book showed up in the third paragraph.
Absolutely. Now, you've mentioned research a couple times and the amount of research you've done for your books. Can you share some information on when research is really necessary for writing a book, and when it is, what's the best way to go about doing that?
Well, we have this wonderful thing called the internet now. Back in the 90s, I used to actually give credit by name to my local reference librarians, who were more than happy to help. And I could do some research myself, but if anything was really deep, I went and had them do it, and they were just delighted. And the last time I think I put librarians in the acknowledgements was that book, Marketing Without Megabucks, in 1993, because since then I've been able to do it myself. What typically is, this is an unorthodox approach, but I'll have a point that I want to make, and then I'll Google for something that will validate my point. And sometimes I find that my point isn't valid, and I have to do some rewriting or rethinking about the book. But most of the time I can generally find something that says exactly what I'm looking for, particularly in the area of how it is actually profitable to address things like hunger, poverty, climate change, racism, et cetera, because there's tons of research out there. And so I'm generally, when I'm doing research, I'm doing secondary research. I'm not conducting a new study for the most part. I've done some very tiny ones with like 20 subjects, but mostly I look for some respected entity like Edelman, a big PR agency that does a trust report every year, or some of the movers and shakers in the green marketing world. They've done all that, and all I have to do is find it and source it. And I think that's just a gift to writers. Oh man, when I was in college, I was working for the college newspaper, and I got the assignment to write the obituary for the 97-year-old former president of the college who had just died. And I had 3 days to research and write it. And that man had done a huge amount of stuff. He was the first president of the Tennessee Valley Authority under Roosevelt. He initiated cooperative education in the United States in the 1930s. It was just huge to have to assimilate all that information and then write it up in 3 days. I'm glad that we've moved to this point where it's just 40 seconds in a Google search and you can find what you need. And then you do, of course, have to look at your sources and say, okay, this one is reputable, this one is not. Can I find somebody else to say the same thing who is reputable? If not, I think I will just move on and not do, because I don't want to be spreading wild, crazy rumors.
Absolutely. Now, most of the people that I work with and encounter are entrepreneurs as well. So they're, life coaches, business coaches, people like that. Do you think that every nonfiction book needs to have some element of research in it, citing studies or citing experts? Do you think that's important?
I'd say usually, but not always. If you're writing a memoir, that's nonfiction. And you don't really need to research much except to confirm that your version of what happened is actually what happened, which means talking to the original sources who are your friends and family. But if you're doing a spiritual guide type book, maybe you don't need to source it very deeply. But if you're telling people how to do something, they want to know that you're the expert. And the way you're the expert is because you read the other experts and parsed out who was telling the truth and who was exaggerating and all that sort of stuff. And I do have a background in journalism. My college didn't offer a journalism major, but they offered a communication major with a few journalism courses, and that's what I did. So I was actually trained to do this. And I've never been sorry that I had that training. It's made me a much better writer. It's made me much more aware of the world around me and how other people fit into it. And I think it's made me able, in the consulting I do, to look across silos to say, okay, this thing was tried in X industry, you're in Y industry, let's see if we can adapt it. And often the answer is yes. And I'm not certainly the only one who does this, but a lot of people don't realize that the drive-in restaurant was actually invented by first the banking industry, and I think the second businesses to do it were dry cleaners of all things. And restaurants were maybe the 10th or 12th industry that came along. I forget exactly, but there were quite a number in the 1930s and 40s before drive-through restaurants started to be a thing. So, and we look at, wow, if I was 6 years old and somebody had given me a pair of Velcro sneakers, I would have been in heaven. I was 8 before I could tie my shoe. That's an import from the space program. If you think about it, astronauts had a need to hang things on walls where they wouldn't float away and bump into them. So that's where Velcro came from. So I love that kind of cross-pollination. I just love it.
Absolutely. Now, last question for you, because you mentioned that, you know, your readers want to know that you're the expert, that you actually know what you're talking about. Is it, I don't want to use the word enough because I don't love that type of comparison, but is it enough to include stories of your own transformation, stories of your clients' transformation as kind of authority measures? Or is it really critical to quote those other experts that are outside of your own business?
Well, it really depends on who your audience is and what they want from you and what you want from them. So the answer is it depends. And I certainly, my own books are a mix. I have many examples from my own practice or from my own life or from my own activism, because I started in marketing actually to promote the social and environmental causes. I was already involved with that since age 12. And it's interesting, when I started this, I was told, oh, you're too young. And now I'm beginning it at 64 to hear, oh, you're too old. And I call BS on both. I had 2 friends who were still activists after their 100th birthday.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I know some who were activists when they were 9 or 6. So you're never too old or too young to make the world better. So yeah, in some cases, if you're a coach and you want to talk about your coaching method and you have 20 examples from your own practice, you may not need to research. But you probably would want to at least find some well-known coaches who will write you a 3 to 5 line blurb that you can put in the front of the book or on the back cover saying, I'm adding this to my toolbox, this is great, or whatever it is. I know marketing is outside the bailiwick of this particular conversation, but there's a lot. I did a whole book on marketing books, and have had a lot of my consulting practice earlier on had been in the book marketing sphere, and some of it still is.
Absolutely. Well, Shel, this has been amazing. I've never learned so much about research in 10 minutes. So thank you so much for sharing all your expertise with us. Is there anything else you'd want to tell first-time authors that are maybe struggling to get to that final draft?
Yeah, I'd say maybe the biggest takeaway, and I expected to bring this up earlier, and we were so busy with other things that I didn't get there. So I'm glad you gave me that opportunity. It's the old, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? I wrote Marketing Without Megabucks in 15, 20, 30-minute chunks, mostly while my daughter was napping, and I used a very primitive TRS-80 Model 100 laptop on the deck while she was sleeping in the playpen on the deck. So I could keep an eye on her, chase away any wandering birds or whatever, and write for a little short time and then download it later to my computer and massage it into something useful. And now I hardly even know anybody who's got a desktop computer anymore. But back then in the early days of the 1990s and 80s, I got my first computer in 1984. And so it's just, when I'm doing a short piece, like an article, I usually don't bother outlining. The outline is mostly just to keep me from wandering too far off the deep end. But I do it a little at a time. And I usually do a book in about 6 months. One book, my book on having fun cheaply, which was less research intensive than the others, that one only took 3 months. But again, if I write 1,000 words in a day, even 500 words in a day, I'm happy with that, unless I'm writing something where there's real time pressure. And I haven't ever done a book like on how to survive the coming Y2K crisis, which was going to go stale on January 1st, 2000.
Absolutely.
So I try to write evergreens that'll still be useful in 5 or 10 years.
Well, Well, I think that is a great tip to end on. So thank you again so much for your time and expertise.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure, Jesse. Thanks for having me.